The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to FAME's webinar, FAME's Community Forum Series 2. We're going to discuss the COVID-19 and stimulus package. All attendees will be placed on mute for the duration of this webinar, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Tom and Sally will begin this webinar at 2 p.m. sharp. Thank you again for logging in early. Sally and Tom, thank you again for holding for me. It looks like we're at 136, so we have a couple of late stragglers. We do have a number of attendees expected for today, so I do appreciate your patience. And again, thanks for providing us this great information in such a timely manner.
Busy times. I'm sure everybody's taking every minute they can.
Definitely. Okay, Tom. Please, good afternoon, Tom and Sally. Please go ahead. Take it away. Thank you.
Good
Sally,
afternoon.
you want to start?
Yes, I do. You know me, Tom. I like to talk. Good afternoon. My name is Sally Samuels. I'm Director of Compliance at FAME, and glad to have you with us. Tom, you want to go to the next page?
Sure.
Thank you. We have some general housekeeping directions there, so just remember you're going to be on mute, so go ahead and type your questions in. We'll try to get to them at the end of the session. If we don't get to them, we'll address them afterwards. We are going to have to stop promptly at 3:30 today. And the handout materials, you can go and download them. One more time. And one more. Wait, stop with you. Go back. I just wanted to introduce Tom Netting. In case you weren't aware of who he is Director of Government Strategies, and he is going to try to give us a rather quick overview of this whole stimulus package, which is not very short. It's pretty long. So he's going to do the best he can to try to cover the stuff. I'm going to be here just to answer any financial aid concerns or questions we might have. And I do want to remind you that FAME does have a hotline. It's the 1-800-327-5772, and you just press option 1, and you will have the availability to talk to anybody at FAME to answer your questions on that hotline about the COVID-19. And also you have the chat availability with customer service. Also, the consulting team is there ready to help you, so please reach out to us if you have any concerns or questions. And the one thing I did want to bring up, there was a lot of conversation about leave of absences and whether or not you can do it and what's the situation that involves, do they have to take a leave, or can they take a leave if they don't want to do distance education? I think we really have a lot of leeway. If you look at the stimulus package, they're even talking about anything that's actually considered an emergency, qualifying emergency, which anything that has to do with COVID-19 is a qualifying emergency. So if the student chooses to take a leave of absence, if they want to drop, if they want to go ahead and do the distance education, whatever the situation is, you have a lot of leeway there. Other than you still can't do more than a 6-month leave. 180 days is your maximum because we haven't had any relief on that. But other than that, it looks like you can do a leave of absence for almost anything, and you can get it signed after the fact if you don't have any other way of doing it. Remember, you can do it through a mobile app, FAME's mobile app. You can do it through an attachment to an email. It cannot be a blank email because anybody can answer that, but it could be an attachment. They can sign it, scan it back to you. There are many, many ways to get that leave of absence done. Go ahead, Tom. Let's move forward.
Well, thank you, Sally. A couple of do's and don'ts from the beginning. One of the first do's and don'ts is that, as Sally said, all of this information is resourced in ways that we can verify directly from Capitol Hill and from other reliable sources that are within the higher education community. One of the things that we may not have is the answer to all of your questions, but in the chat function, we'll try and answer as many of them at the conclusion as we possibly can. Keep in mind that this is a constantly changing environment. We certainly have seen a great deal of new information come out over the weekend since President Trump signed the act into law last Friday, late afternoon, early evening. We'll go over that as part of the overview here in just a few minutes. We did attempt to break this down into basically the same manageable chunks that are provided for in the CARES Act itself. So we hope that we've been able to give you clear and concise summaries, and also then share with you the summary and analysis that we can do based on our reading and review of all of the information. As you can see, what we will go through today is an overview that'll give you just a real quick background on the development and the very quick development of the third package, $2.2 trillion in new spending off the books of the normal appropriations process. We'll also then get into the student benefits, those things in the policy portion of the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act, as everybody shortly talks about the acronym here in Washington. Some of the borrower benefits, including some things that you may or may not have heard previously. Institutional benefits, those things that are in the policy, as well as the new stabilization funding formula that will provide funds to all institutions of higher education for two different primary tracks. One, to help the institution itself in terms of covering costs, and we'll get into what the devil of those details are, and a significant amount of money to go directly to students to cover additional costs for the students. And then, because we know that there are a number of the FAME members that have nursing programs, there was some new and revised language specifically for nursing programs under the healthcare workforce revisions portion of the new law. So we decided to put in a little bit of that information. This is not all inclusive. As we go through, we'll share with you some areas where detail on issues around small businesses, a number of what they're calling the Paycheck Protection Act, which is the ability to provide sustained funding for small businesses and their employers throughout the pandemic and through periods of the pandemic. We didn't go through all of that information given the time that we have, and also some of the complexities of the breakdown of who's included, who's not included, and how those different variations come about, that we're probably going to save that for a later presentation when more of the details are a little clearer. But we will talk a little bit on the periphery of one of the main issues around that we know it will then translate into questions that we've heard already around the potential for the ability to borrow loans under the small business portion and how that may impact your institution's composite scores and other information. So without further ado, we'll start with the overview. As I said just a few minutes ago, this is the third in a series of proposed pieces of enacted legislation now that attempt to address the pandemic that we have with regard to COVID-19. The previous two proposals focused primarily, if not almost exclusively, on funding and actions directly around healthcare and around a number of the occupations and the ability to have funding and access and guidance and provisions around trying to stop the growth of the pandemic, and also ways in which to start trying to support those areas where we knew that there were early issues with the pandemic. Going forward, in this most recent, as I said, $2.2 trillion or $2.3 trillion proposal that is now enacted, they, for the first time, focused on a great deal more funding for not only healthcare and health-related services and immediate urgency for some of the most affected groups, but now much broader focus on support for, as I said previously, small businesses, a whole section on education, both elementary and secondary, as well as higher education institutions, a focus on training and labor training across the whole spectrum of proposals and groups. There's a whole section on aviation as it relates to the FAA and funding for not only the workers that are displaced right now, but education and training there that we'll put together a little summary for. We have a little summary for that we'll share with you at a later point, but trying to keep this at basically, pardon the pun, a 30,000-foot level, as opposed to the nitty-gritty of every deep dive of every provision. We're going to focus on those that we believe are most important to the vast majority of the FAME membership. Timeline, as I said, this was the third and very quick turnaround by Congress, showing that yet again, when times are tough, Congress can and the machine can move very quickly. The CARES Act was actually introduced, and you'll recall some of the earlier reporting from FAME and elsewhere that after the second proposal ink was barely dry, the White House and the House and Senate were already fast at work talking about the Phase 3 proposal, this broad package. They had initial proposals that were brought forward by the Senate Republicans. That proposal fell flat with the House Democrats and with Speaker Pelosi and others, as well as Democrats in the Senate, who said We like the direction you're going in some respects, but we think that there are a number of other things that we would like to see in the proposals. So over the weekend, this past weekend, not this weekend just ended, but the weekend prior, the Democrats set aside time and put together their own proposals. One of those was specifically changes to the Senate version of the CARES Act, and another one was an entirely separate proposal that provided additional funding and even more proposals that is included in the Senate version. Ultimately, the Democratic House version was jettisoned primarily because it was deemed to be too overly burdensome and too expensive. Not that $2.2 trillion is anything to consider as a minimal amount of money, but they worked towards a summary and a compromise between the White House and the Senate Democrats and Republicans, as well as the House Democrats and Republicans that we see in the legislation before us. That was moved through the Senate this past week, with the Senate actually completing and passing it the early part of last week by a vote of 96-0. And by Friday of last week, it moved from the Senate to the House, from Tuesday night in the House to Friday in the Senate, where following about 4.5 hours of debate on the House floor, by voice vote, it was basically almost unanimously supported and adopted by the full House. There were several individuals, Democrats as well as Republicans, that took to the floor to voice their concern with certain portions, or the fact that the overall bill was being done in such a fast manner without the ability, in particular in the House, for modifications after the negotiations had been done between the leadership. AOC on the Democratic side and a gentleman from Kentucky on the Republican side both voiced their strong, urgent concerns that they wish that there would have been a more open process for the purposes of the 435 members of the House to have been involved in negotiating the ultimate compromise that they came up with. Nevertheless, the legislation was enacted. It was signed last Friday evening around 6 o'clock, 6:30 by President Trump, and to a great deal of fanfare on the belief that a number of the provisions in here will help to try and sustain a number of our failing industries and industries that have been so dramatically hurt by the onset of the pandemic, and where we stand some 3.5 to 4 weeks into the pandemic, with certainly, as the president has now said, several more weeks, at least through April 30th, to look at in terms of additional concerns. In terms of breaking this down, as I said before, we're doing this in a manner in which that we hope gives you the ability to think of it in 3 contexts. The first, and it's the way in which a lot of this information was actually presented by Capitol Hill. The first is to look at it from the student perspective, the existing currently enrolled student perspective. And there were a number of benefits that have been provided to those students as a result of the ability or the need and the necessity across the entire country to transition from bricks and mortar and physical participation in higher education to an online environment. And as a result of all of this, there have been a number of changes. 2 of those that specifically impact the future eligibility of students is a waiver of both the opportunity for individuals who choose to withdraw to have neither their existing level of Pell Grants or their existing loan eligibility impacted by this payment period or period of enrollment's amount of funding. The money, basically, in the way in which you can think about this, or certainly the way I think about this, is in essence the current payment period funding is off of the books for all practical intents and purposes. And you'll see what I mean by that when we go through other portions of this proposal. But starting out specifically with the students, neither of the funds that provided for essentially the most recent payment period or the term are going to be counted against the overall Pell or loan limits. Similarly, with regard to individuals that are withdrawing or making decisions about withdrawal, they've made a number of determinations. Congress and the White House made a number of determinations that once again provide significant benefit to the students. In the event that a student drops based as a result of COVID-19, and as Sally said, the determination of why the student drops is really almost irrelevant at this point. If they choose to leave, either because the school stopped or because they determine that they choose not to continue to participate in an online environment, or if realistically, as was the first guidance put forward by the Department of Education, there are specific issues related to COVID-19, such as them contracting the virus or a member of their family contracting the virus, or other implications that cause them to have to stop out in order to be able to meet the the self-quarantining and the self-distancing requirements that play into the fact that those individuals would not be returning to school. What the legislation does is it says that for that period of time, the payment period or period of enrollment that is the most recent, none of those funds have to be returned. So both the Pell as well as the loans, the students and the individuals get to keep for that period. So they're not out anything, they don't lose anything as a result, and they also are not impacted or affected by that same period, as was discussed on the previous slide, with regard to their future eligibility. So it's basically as if they're getting the funding, they don't have to repay the loans, they don't have to look at the Pell eligibility, and they're not impacting their future capability for continuing their education. Similarly, a benefit to the students as well as to the institutions, so I put it here as well as within the institutional benefits section, is the fact that as a result of the fact that none of the funds have to be returned, there's no need or no reason to do an R2T4 calculation. So in the event that the individual were to withdraw during the payment period or period of enrollment, no R2T4 funds calculation needs to be done for those individuals. Third,
Tom,
yes, Sally.
Tom, I'm going to interrupt you there. I'm not sure that they don't have to do a calculation, because it says that it requires each institution using a waiver relating to the withdrawal recipients to report.
It specifically says, this is language directly from the Capitol Hill, waives the requirement that institutions calculate the amount.
Okay.
I'm pretty confident on this one. I've had several conversations. It's basically as if the students get the money, but they don't have any, but there's not any recourse against that money if they were to withdraw. And as a result, because you don't have to give it back, there's no reason to do a calculation.
Okay.
With regard to leaves of absence, as Sally alluded to earlier, and as we've discussed previously, leave of absence, one of the things that the statute, again, specifically states, we all know that the statute, that the existing statute and regulations state under leaves of absence that if an individual takes a leave of absence, that they have to return to the program at the point at which they left off. Well, given the current circumstances and the inability for anybody to forecast right now when individuals are going to be able to come back into bricks and mortar environments or the environment that they were forced to leave, not by their own choosing, as a result of the pandemic, that one of the other waivers that is granted through this process is the reality that individuals don't have to reassert themselves and the institutions are not responsible for bringing themselves back into the program exactly at the point at which they left off under the leave of absence. Sally, do you want to reemphasize the LOA or any of these provisions again, or am I doing okay?
No, you're fine. Yeah, again, the LOA looks like they can get a leave of absence for almost anything. And the only thing you can't do is allow them more than 180 days at this point, because they've not made any change to that.
And I think the important point is exactly your last statements. At this point, if we have the continuation, as it looks like we very well may, of longer periods of time away, there could be in the next iteration or in the next development of additional legislation, there might be guidance that would provide for a longer leave of absence if, in fact, things continue to unfortunately take more time for us to flatten the curve and for the nation to work its way back towards the start of a recovery from the pandemic. Another major change is with regard to satisfactory academic progress. Similar to the other benefits, a student who drops out of the program would also not have the negative effects, or could not, or is protected from any negative effects of the academic requirements put onto their record. That it says that students are given the opportunity to include it if it's beneficial or not, if it's not, as well as the academic requirements for the loans. So again, what the intent of Congress appears to be, and their goal throughout this process was, in long conversations with a number of them, was to do as little to no harm to students as possible, recognizing that this was, in their view and in the view of many attempting to advocate for various positions, that students were in positions that they, along with institutions, had never been in before, and as a result needed to have as many outs, if you will, or as many ways in which to be protected as possible. So they're trying to make the students as whole as possible as this process goes forward. So they addressed both the lifelong Pell Grant and loan limits, the funding for the current period, and then also how satisfactory academic progress plays into that process as well. A couple of other major provisions from the student benefit, those that we just finished with are probably most relevant to our community, but there were a couple of others that I just wanted to share with you because they are part of the CARE Act as well. There are provisions with regard to the National Service Corps, with regard to the utilization of those awards. And once again, if an individual has their duties suspended or placed on hold, there is still the ability to protect those funds for the future and protect the ability for individuals to have access to those funds. With regard to obligations for teachers, interestingly enough, it talks about, with regard to teach grants, that they attempt to try and make it so that individuals that are very near the completion of their education, but even if they can't get to it, they're ineligible to keep the full amount of their service award for the year, even if the year can't be completed. And they're also still eligible for the teacher loan forgiveness requirements under the proposals. Switching over now from the students and the actual current students to borrowers, the major changes that I think caught a lot of the headlines, and I've seen multiple times on various different media outlets, are the benefits provided to borrowers. And this relates to their FDSLP loans and any loans controlled by the Department of Education. So FFEL consolidated loans controlled by the Department of Ed fall into this category, as well as the FDSLP loans. And what it would provide is that basically everything is frozen, and individuals would not have to make payments on interest, principal, and their interest rates are frozen, and loan repayments are frozen for a period of time. Oh, I'm sorry. This is I'm sorry. I went to the other one first. This is the provision that I was talking about with regard to the employers. I put this one in front of the other one because it came sequentially first. One of the things that was also included is a provision whereby there is a tax benefit and a tax break for employers if they choose to and are willing to pay up to a maximum of $5,250 of the amount of student loan debt of an employee of theirs. So the employer would get the tax break, the individual would get, the employer would get the benefit of a reduction of up to $5,250 in their student loan indebtedness, and that this would provide the opportunity for that program to be done in a manner that provides an incentive for employers to take advantage of that in the near term in order to help take care of student debt. You will note here that it says that the cap applies to both new student loan repayment benefits as well as other educational assistance provided by the employer under current law, and also the fact that this will be a provision that the employer may make on behalf of an enactment from now through January 1st of 2021. So they're giving this opportunity for the employers for the full length of the year. Many of the provisions in the CARES Act are limited to a shorter time frame that is related to the conclusion of the pandemic. But in order for this to be something that potentially employers could utilize after they get on the backside, everyone would hope, of the pandemic and see where they are, they could then still utilize the opportunity for this and maybe some of their small business loans as a portion of the way in which to pay down some of these loan repayment rates, or excuse me, loan repayments for borrowers, i.e. their employers. Going to the provision that I just started on before I got to the employer provision, the Secretary and the Secretary in the CARES Act has been given the authority to allow for the deferral of student loan payments, and that includes not only the payment principal and interest for a 6-month window that ends on September 30th, 2020, but there also are no penalties for borrowers for any of the federally owned programs. This is what I was alluding to, where it includes the federal direct loans and the loans that are FFELP loans that have been brought into and are under the control of the department under the direct loan program. By accounts and by the belief of the individuals that put forth this legislation, they believe that this will provide relief of some sort for up to 95% of student borrowers that are currently enrolled in the programs. Sally, anything you want to add there?
No, not at the moment. Thank you.
Okay. I just thought that this was a kind of a cute encapsulation of maybe the notion of borrower benefits right now. You see the piggy bank with the mask and the money at the top. Just trying to bring a little levy into a rather serious set of circumstances that we all find ourselves in. Shifting on to the institutional benefits, we believe that and can show that there are a number of benefits to the institution. A number of these candidly focus on other sectors of the higher education community, perhaps more so than ourselves, but nevertheless, in the interest of sharing with you all of those benefits, in the off chance that some of these might be at least nominally important to you, the three that are included here are waivers of the institutional matching requirement for campus-based aid programs and the allowance of the ability to take funds and transfer them from one fund to the other. Institutions being able to modify the use of their SEOG funds for purposes of COVID, and then also changes made to federal work-study funds under the qualifying emergency, which again, right now everything basically falls under the pretty loose and liberal definition of a qualifying emergency. And what it does is it enables the institution to continue to pay students for portions of the work that they do and find creative ways in order for them to earn that funding, so that individuals that are counting on those work-study funds as a regular portion of their aid package don't lose that whole set of funding simply because they're no longer on campus or no longer able to provide the type of responsibilities or fulfill the responsibilities with other work-study entities that they are working with.
Tom.
Again, because it is important to the institutional side on the R2T4 calculation, I put that one in here as a reminder. Some others that are important, but again, less so I think for our community. There were significant guidance put forward with regard to foreign institutions and how foreign institutions are to work through specific issues with Title IV funds during the pandemic. There is and was a national emergency education waiver provided. This is something you might have heard more about in previous iterations of the bill. You'll notice that it says here that it provides the Secretary of Education with broad legislative and regulatory authority, meaning the ability to waive both statute and regulations for portions of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The original version of this put forward by the Senate Republicans provided the opportunity for not only those waivers capability for the Secretary in elementary and secondary education, but also under the Perkins Vocational and Technical Careers Education Act and the Higher Education Act. In the course of the negotiations that took place 2 weekends ago, the Democrats in particular in the back and forth pushed very hard and said that given the number of other provisions that were providing benefits to higher education and the nominal number of changes that were focused on elementary and secondary education and concerns they had about the ability for the secretary to grant authorities that would go further in directions they don't like, with things like gainful employment, 90-10, borrower defense to repayment, and the like, to say nothing of Title IX as well. They decided, and they pushed very hard, and ultimately the decision was made not to give the secretary authority in any of the two higher education level programs, the same way that is being provided right now in elementary and secondary. You see I put an asterisk there. That asterisk is because those negotiations were rather contentious, and one of the things that took a while to sort out, as Democrats, Republicans, and the White House were fighting for this package and the determination of what would or would not be in it. As we move forward, I fully anticipate, especially in light of some of the provisions for students and institutions that we're discussing today, there are going to be consequences, some of them unintended, some of them potentially just not thought through well enough, that are going to require, I believe, and I think many, many others in the higher education community are, I believe, are going to require either, if not broad authority for the secretary to address, a new round of guidance by statute to address those issues. We're thinking in terms of things like, if you're provided loans under the small business loan program, how does that impact your financial responsibility requirements and your composite score? If you are all dealing with, as we all know, all institutions will, a reduction in revenue, how does that impact your composite score? How does all of these beneficial changes with regard to student loan payments and the freezing of payments and the ability for those to not count against the student equate to the future of what is going to be the determinations of cohort default rates and loan repayments as we look 1, 2, 3 years down the road? As we know, a number of these regulations are trailing proposals, and will take that amount of time for the decisions and determinations and the relief and the microcosm of time that things are being done here will have certainly a ripple effect and factor much, much further into the future. How does that all integrate and work with one another? We believe requires the opportunity for the Secretary and certainly Congress to contemplate what protections, or at least what opportunities for waivers or other forms of safety nets or provisions might be required going into the future, especially since we still don't know how long we're in this for and how much longer some of the requirements that are even in this proposal might need to be extended or even modified. You'll also see Congress once again took the opportunity to take care of their minority serving institutions. There was additional money provided for HBCUs, minority serving institutions, and tribal institutions as a portion of the institutional benefits. And while the Secretary was not granted the waivers to provide for all of higher education, the statute does include 2 areas where specifically for HBCUs and MSIs, and also for targeted programs under Title III, Title V, and Title VII, to have benefits that give them things that they are not going to be required to do under Section 3518. For the most part, both of those, and 3517, a lot of those are the waiver requirements for the outcomes that come along with the utilization of the funds that they are not going to be required to do as a for fiscal year 2021 as a result of the changes that are here. One could ask the question, and several already have, of why only for these groups of institutions serving populations similar to many, many other groups of institutions, as we'll talk about here in a few minutes, are they given the opportunity for waivers, and yet the rest of the community in totality of reporting requirements and consumer information are not given the same opportunities. I'll stop there for a second, see if there's any questions on the policy side before we move on to the institutional benefits, and give Sally an opportunity to fill in anything I may have left out before we get into one of the things that I think is new information for everybody and something that I think you'll find very beneficial.
Actually, Tom, I think you pretty well covered everything. So at this point, I guess we'll see. Can you see any questions there? I see that.
I cannot where I am, but I can try and open it
Let
up.
me see if I can get to the questions down here.
Okay, I can give you the first question that came in. Let's see, as of what date are R2T4s not required?
It is specifically for those students, and again, we will go back and reconfirm this, because when Sally and I aren't on the same page, that always worries me. But the way in which the statute is constructed, and with information forthcoming from the Department of Ed in the very near future, especially on what we're about to get to, it is for individuals that have withdrawn during the most recent payment period or period of enrollment. It is linked to the current term and to the COVID-19 responses. This is all in the context of, and that's one of the things that, again, let me reemphasize if it wasn't clear, all of these benefits, institutional, students, and borrower, are all under the framework and under the guise of addressing ways in which to provide students, borrowers, and institutions relief during the pandemic. Once the pandemic is through, there will be transitions back away from these requirements and opportunities back to the norm in terms of federal statute and federal regulations. So this only is for individuals and students that it takes place during the pandemic. So I hope that's helpful, and it would therefore be individuals, and again, the dates get a little bit fuzzy. The department has put forth guidance beginning back on March 5th, and again on March 20th. This was signed into law on the 27th. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what some of the parameters in terms of time are and the specifics around it. But it is all drafted and written in the context of helping individuals based on the pandemic. I hope that helps answer that question.
Yes.
I would actually think it would vary from state to state, because you have some states that just recently started to close, have very few problems. And then you have some states that, you know, it's already been going on for several weeks. So I think it's going to depend, and you can't just blanket everybody across the nation, because I think it's going to vary based on, you know, what's happening in your area. If you're in an area that's had no virus, and there are still some, you know, states that have very little and some cities that don't have any. And whether or not you've had to close your schools, I think it's going to make a difference on whether or not you can just blanket this whole thing, but I don't know for sure.
And don't you think, Sally, that some of this, again, recognizing that, you know, we're all still learning as this goes through, don't you think some of this is also going to be the department will try and, for lack of a better term, you know, make it as broad
Flexible,
and broadly defined, yeah. And but terms defined as possible. But as you said, a lot of it then might relate back to the individual states and different timeframes and parameters when states allowed you to do things. But the statute is very clear, and you can see me kind of moving over to the side. I'm trying to find, the specific language directly in the statute where it talks to hold on, give me half a second, where it talks to the fact that it's for the payment period of enrollment. So
right.
That for some of these provisions will also help to determine or provide the finite determination of when and how it's applied. Give me half a second. Institutional refills.
Add up, Tom. I'm going to read you the section, or a little section here. I know you said you had conversations. First of all, my question is does the school have to request a waiver? Because it says they may waive, and requires each institution using a waiver relating to withdrawal. So does the school have to request a waiver, or is that an automatic thing? Do you know?
It's an automatic waiver.
Okay.
Again, because the context here is that the individual, based on the qualifying emergency, again, if you read through it, the institutional waiver, the secretary shall waive the institutional requirements under the R2T4 with respect to the amount of grant or loan assistance to be returned under such section if the recipient of the assistance withdraws from the institution during the payment period or period of enrollment as a result of a qualifying emergency.
Okay, but my little question before had to do with little double I. Secretary may waive amounts the students are required to return in the section.
You're working off of old version.
Okay.
I can read you again. I'll read you all four of the sections in their entirety off of the final text. Institutional refunds and federal student loan flexibility. A, institutional waiver. In general, the Secretary shall waive the institutional requirement under Section 484B of the Higher Education Act, that's the R2T4 calculations, with respect to the amount of grant or loan assistance other than assistance received under C of Title IV, which is federal work study, to be returned under such section if a recipient of assistance under the Title IV of the Higher Education Act withdraws from the institution of higher education during the payment period or period of enrollment as a result of a qualifying emergency. 2, waivers. The Secretary shall require each institution using a waiver relating to the withdrawal of recipients under this subsection to report the number of such recipients, the amount of loan assistance minus work study associated with each such recipient, and the total amount of grant and loan assistance for which each institution has not returned assistance under the Title IV to the Secretary.
Okay,
B.
so stop right there. My question is, wouldn't you have to calculate that amount that you didn't have to return? I think you do.
Well, yes, you have to calculate it, but you're not having to return it.
Right, but we're saying R2T4s did not have to be done. R2T4s do have to be done. They just don't have to.
For purposes of reporting, I guess, yes. For purposes of reporting, but I was thinking of it in terms of.
Yeah, they don't have to do a calculation. I believe they need to continue to calculate, just not return the money.
In order to show the reporting, I think you're right.
Yes, okay, thank you for that clarification.
To read the rest of it, just so you can hear it all. The Secretary shall waive the amount that the students are required to return with respect to the federal grants or the other grant assistance if the withdrawals of which the returns are based are withdrawals by the student who withdrew from the qualifying emergency. That's letting loose of the grant assistance. Canceling of loan obligation. Notwithstanding any other provision, the Secretary shall cancel the borrower's obligation to repay the entire portion of the loan made under Part D associated with the payment period for a recipient of such loan who withdraws from the institution during the payment period as a result of the qualifying emergency. So I get your point, Sally. I guess I was thinking of it in terms of you don't have to do the calculations for compliance, but for reporting you do.
Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. Other questions?
I think we'll hold off the questions until the end just to make sure you can get through everything, both you and Sally.
Okay. Moving on to, again, the new section that a lot of people have asked questions about because I think they're just starting to hear it as a result of an article that was put out today by ACE and NASFA, the American Council on Education, and NASFA, National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. We have known and we're keeping a great deal of tabs on a provision within the appropriation side of the CARES Act. Keep in mind, I just discussed with you a number of the policy provisions. Now we're getting into truly fiscal, financial aspects of changes to the law as a result of the law. And one of those was the development of an education stabilization fund. These were last used in 2009 and did not include our sector in them as portions of attempts to bail out from prior concerns of former economic stimuluses and recoveries. I'm happy to say that this time around, we are included in the overall utilization of the funds that will be dispersed back to institutions. And we're about to talk to you about the amount of those funds, how they're to be dispersed, and a little bit about early estimations that have been done by ACE and NASFA based on iPads and other data. But we wanted to share this information with you now as well. As you can see, The stabilization funds are an attempt to try and provide support both for the institutions, recognizing that there are considerable costs associated with the changes that needed to be in order to convert from online, from bricks and mortar, campus-driven, face-to-face education to the delivery now of basically all education being online or by some other form of modality other than the ability for individuals to be in the normal campus bricks and mortar setting. So Congress looked at the need for support for all institutions of higher education and developed a series of proposals and a considerable amount of funding to help to try and address those, both for the institution and for the students that are having to be displaced, and the concerns around how to keep them hopefully engaged and not withdrawing from the program and from the institution, but recognizing that there could be a number of circumstances that need to be, assistance needs to be provided for, and greater assistance would need to be provided for in order to prevent that individual from feeling like they had to withdraw. As a result, the bill, basically $2.2 trillion, includes specifically $14.25 billion directly focused on higher education. There is overall a considerable amount of more money, and there's a breakdown of percentages of some $30 billion overall that is provided under this section. But there is one section of it goes, about $3 billion goes to governors, and the ability for governors to diffuse that within the state. There's another whole section for elementary and secondary. We're not focused on either of those two, although future information we will share will give some information about that. We're focused just specifically on the $14.25 billion that is earmarked directly for higher education. Within that, basically what has been done is there's been the desire and the design to break the program, and this is the actual statutory language, of the money that is available, some $6 billion and $6.5 billion goes directly to higher education. And of that allocation, again, there are certain parameters of how they are to get, the Department of Education, are to divvy up the money. Within the $6.5 billion, an estimated 90% of it, or $5.8+ billion, would go to institutions to provide support and relief and modifications for entities with high Pell populations of individuals that were not previously involved in online education, using full-time equivalents of Pell Grants. The second half of that of the 90%, 75% of that would be based on the full-time equivalent, 25% would be based on individuals that were not full-time equivalents that are of Pell eligible students. So you've got the 90% chunk, and then that 90 is divided up between 75 and 25% based on Pell eligibility, full-time equivalent, and non. But both of these and all of these are individuals that were not previously fully enrolled in online education. The premise here and the intent here, once again, is to look at all of the institutions and all of the students that had to transition as a result of the pandemic away from bricks and mortar, or the hybrid of bricks and mortar and online education, to a fully online environment. They don't contemplate in this particular portion funding for recognition of how to fund for individuals that are already over in the online environment, because they think of this as that's already where they were. Another 7.5% would go to Title III, Title V, and Title VII recipients. Once again, this is a designation that helps and provides a great deal of assistance specifically for HBCUs, MSIs, and tribal institutions. And then another portion of it, again, goes directly to the technology costs and other costs for Title VII institutions. So you think of this, of the $6.5 billion, basically there is some, of the 6.5, 90% of it, so the portion that basically our community would have some opportunity to have portions of is really that $5.8 billion total. What are the funds able to be used for? They are very specific in the statute that, as I said before, there are basically two trains leaving the station with regard to the money. 50% of the money can be used by the institution for issues related to the institution and the need to cover the cost of the transition to online education and the other significant costs associated with the delivery in the wake of the coronavirus, as long as those funds are not applied to pre-enrollment activities or other specific activities related to endowments or capital outlays, i.e. buildings and the like associated with the institution. So it can be used for everything up to and including payroll for the institution as a part of the transfer. The other 50% must go directly to the students in the form of support for the students as a result of their being inconvenienced, disposed, dislocated, choose whatever term you'd like, as part of the pandemic. So it talks specifically about the ability for the funds to be used to recognize if there are additional funds needed, obviously for childcare, healthcare, technology, course materials, food, housing, and other cost of attendance related issues. So within this funding, the money will come to the institution, and it's important to note that these funds are going to come to you as the institution from the Department of Education. It says in the statute that it should be delivered in the same way in which the Department of Education delivers federal student financial aid. So we can interpret that to mean that the money will come to you in the institution through some form of your normal accounts within the drawdowns of financial aid that you receive for loans and others. How they're going to make sure that the distinction and the differentiation of those funds versus loan funds and other funds is something I'm sure we're going to hear much more about from the Department of Education in the not too distant future. While I don't have any guarantee for you, and I've quit trying to handicap guarantees since I've been telling you that the Title IX regulations were going to come since literally last November, December, or January. The department officials that I have spoken with have been very clear that they are working very, very hard on this particular aspect and will be providing as much information to all of higher education as soon as they possibly can. They're hoping within the next week or two. There are a couple of special provisions. Again, if you don't fall into the normal categories, there is the ability for institutions to receive at least $500,000 if you meet specific criterion. Again, the HBCUs and the MSIs are under Title III, under 3, 5, and 7, are given some additional opportunity or recognition. And there is a report that is required from the department once all of these funds are delivered in order to make sure that the tracking of it moves forward. What I can tell you is that if you are members of NASFA, they did provide an article earlier today that speaks directly to the same information that I just provided and shared with you in terms of the justifications of where the money is to go and what the money is for. What they provided that I do not have the access to, but they did, is they literally have gone so far as to present a preliminary analysis, literally broken down in alphabetical order by institution, by state, giving a breakdown of both Pell full-time equivalent amounts of anticipated awards to the institution for Pell full-time equivalent amounts, and for the 25% that falls under the non-Pell full-time equivalent amount, and then a total that goes with literally each institution. And every institution is included, privates, nonprofits, for-profits, publics as well, all listed one right after the other in alpha order by state, alpha by state and alpha by institution within that state. So I would encourage you, if you haven't already looked, obviously this is something I'm quite certain your institution is going to be interested in terms of the funds that are available to you, and then recognizing that of that total and recognizing that it is a preliminary analysis and only an estimate. Once you receive whatever the funds that you are, you do need to be aware that, once again, 50% can go to the house, as it were, but 50% must be used, a minimum of 50% must be used for students. Moving to the last of our sections and leaving about a half an hour for questions. So I'm hoping I'm right about on track. One of the last things that we did want to share with you, there have been a number of questions within our community, both as the CARES Act was being developed and prior to and now afterwards, on how to address individuals in nursing programs that are attempting to complete their clinic but have been sent away based on either the governor's requirements of what are essential employees or aren't, and the determinations made by hospital and others of who, either the states or the feds or the entity itself, of whom is maintained and who isn't. The statute did provide for a number of changes under the Public Health Services Act with regard to nursing programs. It updated a number of the requirements that had been intended for a reauthorization that are included, and also talked about a number of ways in which to focus more on clinical nurses being added to everything from the oversight body to the specific forms of disciplines that are given recognition and given access to the various grant funds under the nursing grant assistance programs. It also did talk about ways in which a number of the entities that acquire these students should be looking to move them forward as quickly as possible to help with what will likely be a shortage and the concerns with the pandemic of even bigger of a shortage. It didn't specifically do, as a number of our institutions and other institutions within the higher education community have requested, in asking that they be specifically defined under the Public Health Services Act as essential employees, and that they be given the opportunity, especially like with the teachers that you heard me allude to earlier, be given the opportunity, if they were in the final stages of their clinical, to complete their education in order to become some certified nurses and potentially help with the pandemic and help serve in the capacity of all of our frontline individuals that are attempting to address all of the concerns in the hospitals and all of the various different settings. There are a number of provisions in this that give the clinics, once again, and the hospitals as well, various latitude on who they keep and who they don't keep. We do see this as similar to other provisions, the waiver authority for the secretary and several others, as being things that both Congress and the regulatory bodies themselves, in this case the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as potentially the Department of Education, might look at ways in which to address this issue. There have been a number of write-ups recently on the fact that there is the high demand for the nurses and the individuals at all different nursing levels to be given the opportunity to serve. So we're continuing to watch on behalf of all of the FAME membership that are involved in allied health and specifically nursing programs, not to the demise of others, but as we see specific programs where they are attempting to move, Congress, the administration, the agencies themselves are attempting to move forward with additional guidance and ways in which to further important issues related to our students and our education programs and offerings. We'll continue to share that with you as well. Last but certainly not least, as I alluded to earlier, there are specific provisions under the small business requirements that we will be looking to provide you additional information on in a future webinar or in guidance in writing at a future point in time. It is just such a level of tax-related and nuanced information that candidly is not, at least I'll speak only for myself, not my normal level of familiarity. Right. So the desire was made by FAME and myself that we wanted to make absolutely certain that we had as much factual information, and again, the ability to source that information before going much further and talking about the small business loan programs and other things that you might hear reported from others, both in the media and in the plethora of additional webinars to come from various resources within our community. With that, I will stop and take a sip of my Mountain Dew, give Sally the opportunity to circle back on anything else that I might have left out or missed, and then we will turn it over to you for questions.
Thank you, Tom. That was great. The only concerns I have, which all of you probably have some of the same concerns, is the loans being put on hold and what's going to happen with those students. They're in deferment, but how's that going to affect other things in the future? I think there's going to be a lot of confusion out there with the whole community on how the students handle this and what's going to happen with cohort default rates. I didn't see anything that said that we didn't have to get those reports in, appeals in. Some of that stuff has been put on hold and it's got a very quick deadline coming up. So I don't know. There's so much uncertainty out there. I'm sure we're going to get relief on a lot of things, but it may be a day-to-day event, and we're not going to know from one day to the next, you know, what we have going on. I mean, if the IRS can extend our tax deadline, I'm sure we ought to be able to extend some deadlines like on cohort default rates and things like that. But I don't really have a lot to add. I think we'd rather go ahead and do the questions and see what people have. Like Tom alluded, the whole business problem, the business loans, we're not sure how they're going to handle it. And it's not the Department of Ed per se, it's the accounting regulations for how you handle financial statements and how they handle long-term debt now. So that's one of those iffy ones that until we know whether we're going to get some relief on 90/10 or any of the other things, we don't know how anything's going to be affected. Borrower defense. You know, we're currently still under the 2016 rules, so that's another whole mess for us. So
I can tell you, Sally, that there, you know, again, the department is working towards some of these. And again, one of the major resources that I think we all utilize is NASFA. One of the things that NASFA did talk about, last Friday, was that with regard to single audits, a number of institutions have single audits that are due currently or are coming up on their due dates, being tomorrow or in the very, very near future. And there was a number of chains going around about whether or not there would be an extension of the timeline for those audits. I can tell you that there was a memo put forward by NASFA that said that in the NASA's podcast from this past Friday night, they stated that schools required to submit a single audit due on 3/31 have been granted a 6-month extension to submit and did not need to do anything to get the extension. That is, and they cite a reference and a link that I'll send to you that's part of their podcast that they said came directly from the department. Again, information coming fast and furious and from so many different places. You're right, Sally. I think one of the things that's going to be a challenge, but in a good way for a number of us, is to continue to provide the FAME membership and our entire community with as many of these updates as timely as we can, and candidly to stay on top of them and you know, source them as they come.
okay, Joe, do you want
Yes, thank you so much, Sally and Tom. It looks like our first question, Tom already answered a question with regard to audit deadlines of June 30th. So our next question is, have you heard about our ability to continue to enroll new students?
You can enroll.
I thought we covered that in our last conference, but I would direct you to the March 20th guidance from the Department of Education. In that March 20th guidance, the first question that was included in the frequently asked questions that they provided was a question that says, and I'll just read you the question and the answer, and again, you take from it what you will, but this is me giving you exactly what came from the department. The guidance in the electronic announcements published May 5th, 2020 indicates that the guidance and relief do not apply to students who have not yet enrolled or whose term has not yet begun as of that date. We plan to switch from an on-campus to an online format for a term that will begin in May. Does this guidance apply to us? The response from the department is the original guidance did limit the flexibility of students, limit the flexibility to students who were already enrolled in a term when COVID-related interruptions occurred. Given recent advice by the CDC about social distancing, we have determined that it would be prudent to extend the flexibility to students who enroll in a payment period that begins on or before June 1st, 2020. We will continue to monitor the situation and will extend the time frame for the guidance if appropriate. To me, that reads like you now have the ability to continue to enroll.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Tom. Our next question, is New Jersey allowed to teach online for a full schedule, theory and practical?
That would be up to the state and the accrediting agency.
Okay.
I mean, Department of Ed says, you know, as long as you have state and accrediting agency, you can do whatever. So it's usually the state that is a lot more restrictive, but there are some accrediting agencies that are limited to how much you can do online.
Thank you.
And this is one of the areas where I think a lot of caution is needed. Each state, in a number of instances, depending on specifically a number of disciplines, cosmetology being one of them, but not the only one, there are a number of differentiations state by state. The amount of eligibility in the state of South Carolina for cosmetology for online is only 25%. The Department of Education and NACAS allow for 50%. But because the state is more limited in that particular state, you have to go with the smaller, more limited amount. To your point and to your question, I am not familiar with all 50 states at this particular point. I certainly think that that is something that, as Sally said, that we all need to be very much aware of, depending on your disciplines, depending on your programs, and depending upon the authority that has oversight over you at the state level. You need to be very familiar with what the guidance of those various entities are and follow that guidance.
Thank you again, Tom. Thank you for that, Sally. It looks like our next question, is there a new way to report on NSLDS that shows that the student dropped due to COVID-19? And how will the system know not to count SULA, Pell, lifetime eligibility used?
I think it's only going to know how not to count it if you we do that report to the department. I don't know any other way they're going to know. Like the student withdrew and whether or not there would have been a refund due, and then even though the school doesn't have to refund it, that way they know who dropped due to COVID-19. And right now, I think they're kind of indicating that you don't have to do much reporting to NSLDS until you get to a point that you're sure that student's gone.
And that's kind of where I got in the hiccup, Sally, of since you, in conversations with people in the department, and I won't name names here, they talked about the fact that, you know, you're not going to have to do it. So again, this question could be, and this is one let's capture and take back to the department, because like with so many things, guys, they're trying to figure this all out too. This is uncharted territory for them, the same way it is for us. The good news is that they are being very receptive to questions. As we stated in last week's webinar, there is a whole new area, COVID-19 at ed.gov, where you can send and submit your questions. I would strongly encourage you in a cogent fashion, you know, think it through, but put it together and send it to them. They are trying to work through it. Again, like all of us, there's so much of this that we're all trying to wrap our heads around. So sharing the information with them is certainly well received by them. I can tell you that with confidence and benediction, and certainly share it with us. And as we continue to work through the ability to, as we can, circle back with them and ask more and more questions. I've done that with a couple of the attorney groups already and with a couple of the accountant groups already. So continue to share that through FAME, and we will try and do our best to get those answers, get those questions at least submitted in the hopes that they will come out on all of the FAQs and additional information forthcoming from the department.
And again, if you feel uncomfortable submitting the question, send it to FAME. We don't know the answer, we'll forward it and try to get an answer.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Tom. Looks like our next question is, does the waived interest for student loans apply to new enrollments?
My understanding is it applies to everybody right now. But
Yes.
new enrollments, remember that they're not going to have, well, they will have interest accumulating, but it's deferred for the 6 months anyway, so in most cases, but.
The answer is yes. I mean, all of the benefits are, again, that this comes back to the enrolled question. All of the benefits are for any of the individuals for the payment periods that started when the pandemic started and go through the period of time, at least through June 1 and potentially longer, depending on the various stop points of or additional points of where they go with some of these provisions. And that's one of the other things we're going to have to keep an eye on, is because a lot of these aren't going to all align, as we've talked about previously. It could be different depending on your institution, and your institution's time frame could be different from somebody else's and have different deadlines. If you're continuing enrolling, you're certainly going to have more circumstances than an institution that only enrolls every month, and certainly for those term-based and others as well.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Thank you, Tom. I had heard we still had to keep up with refunds not executed to report to Ed at some point.
Well, I think your answer was earlier that you have to calculate the refunds, you just don't have to return the money.
Okay.
Correct.
And I
Or
think
that report that you will be asked to submit at some point in time in the future, so that at least there's the tracking of it. I think that's so Congress, among others, can see how much that equates to over time, because they're going to want to know a lot of these questions that, how many people are continuing versus how many dropped, and how much does that play into the estimates of how much this is going to cost the federal government in real terms versus their estimates.
It looks like our next question is a bit of a addition to the last, and it says no R2T4 calculation starts on what day?
anytime that you are considered part of this pandemic. So any students that have dropped, I would say probably in most areas from January on, because we've been in this situation for a while now. We didn't go to distance ed until the schools in your area had to close, but that's splattered all over the place. So you're just going to have to pay attention to what's happening in your area, and was that student part of this period that's part of the crisis?
I would say definitively from March 5th forward, or March 13th and March 20th, which is where the department put forward additional guidance with regard to some of the loan issues. But Sally is right. Depending on when you can show that the individual or the individual can help you show that their departure and their withdrawal was as a result of the pandemic, like let's say, and again, the early instances of guidance put forth by the department in the March 15th proposal specifically alluded to circumstances where somebody either had directly caught the virus and needed to be self-quarantined, or had responsibilities to be supportive of others or things of that nature. And that goes all the way back to the beginning of March. So, again, I think that you need to be careful with when the time frame is, but the statute is pretty clear. If you can draw the tie to the qualifying emergency, which is the pandemic, that it is something that can be counted. I certainly wouldn't, again, I would document heavily whenever that is, and I certainly wouldn't look to abuse that circumstance, because even though you're going to be reporting, not submitting, people are going to be watching.
Yeah, and remember, Washington State, I think, was the first big problem. And
Right.
until we knew what was going on and everything, they were already in trouble before this information came out. So
Amen.
you just have to pay attention to, when was it effective in your area? Why did the student drop? If they just disappeared and you never heard from them, and you don't have any evidence that it had to do with the COVID-19 and it wasn't in your area at that point, I certainly wouldn't say, oh yeah, this kid dropped because of that, because you have no evidence of that.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
Okay, so now it looks like the question is, again, a spinoff of the R2T4. What about funds that could have been dispersed if they withdrew? Would we figure an R2T4 for the post-withdrawal disbursement?
You would do the post-withdrawal disbursement just like you always do. Your R2T4 calculations wouldn't change. You just don't have to do refunds. If the money's due, you still have that money coming to you. If it's a Pell, the loan, obviously, there's most circumstances you have to get permission from the student, etc. But you're going back to your return to Title IV calculation is exactly the same. It's just the fact you don't have to return any money. And if the student owes money, the student doesn't have to return money.
Okay, thank you, Sally.
You're welcome.
For term students, must they return within the same term for an LOA?
No.
Okay,
They
thank you.
might come back to the same point.
Okay.
The problem is if they can't come back within the term, you're going to have to withdraw them because they can't come back just out of nowhere. If they can come back within the same term, and then you can do an LOA, but they don't have to come back to the same point. So the student could take maybe an LOA for a month, but right now most of these schools aren't even open. So if they're open, it's kind of, can they make that work up to still complete the term? Are they going to complete terms? It's a whole area that we don't know much about, but basically the only rule that changed said they didn't have to come back at the same spot. It didn't say they didn't have to come back within the same term. In a term-based school, they have to be able to come back. You can't have terms that are, you can't take an LOA in term 1 and have the student come back in term 2. That isn't how aid's paid, and that isn't how R2T4s are calculated.
Okay, thank you, Sally.
No, they can't.
Okay, it looks like our next question is, do these students have to withdraw immediately for these flexibilities to be applicable? Can the student take an LOA and then drop later, or will Section 3508 flexibilities still apply?
I don't think we know for sure, but I'm assuming if the student took the LOA and it had to directly do with the pandemic, and then it's time to do the return to Title IV, that there would be some flexibility, but I don't know if that's true. I'm assuming it would be true because it had to do with the period.
I completely, I agree with you. I think that is, it's not, again, that is one where I don't think that's necessarily what they were contemplating when they wrote it, but the way in which they've constructed it, I think that's the interpretation, because once again, if you look to their underlying and their overarching intent here, it is to do no harm to the student with regard to their loans and their grants and the like. Continue to give them that funding, not have it have to go back. So as long as it's during the emergency pandemic, I think that those rules would apply.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Thank you for that, Tom. Our next question is, how will the servicer know when the student drops if this is for the virus that the student won't be charged for the funds not returned?
I'm not sure. I think you're going to have to notify us that, this was a result of the pandemic. I mean, I'm assuming almost anybody that drops during this period is going to be related, but I don't know. The student could just disappear. You don't know why they dropped, and I don't think they've clarified if they just disappear, what we do with them.
Okay, thank you, Sally. It looks like our next question is, For those students who are returning from a leave of absence but are approaching the 180-day maximum, what is the best course of action? Our school is currently not approved to teach using distance learning.
You're going to have to drop them.
Have you ever drop them?
When you drop them, it's not going to hurt them. It's, because you're going to do the RTT4, nobody has to return the money, and it's not going to hurt them against with their Pell and Loan lifetime eligibilities. Sula.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Thank you, Tom. Next question is, what if all students take the LOA? Are you technically open during the time it is safe to return to the campus? Or do
I
they
would
have
say no. I mean, if you're not teaching distance ed and you don't have classes at a school, you are not open. So you are temporarily closed until this pandemic, is done with. You can't have an LOA if the school's not available to teach classes.
Okay. And then it looks like,
It's temporary.
okay, if a student in a clock hour program chooses to do distance learning from this time, but cannot make all the live online clock hours due to work, children, etc., are those hours missed, marked as absent?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
If a student withdraws schools, okay, so I'm trying to make sense of this. So it says if a student withdraws, just to confirm, are schools not required to return refunds? This applies to withdrawals after which date, which I think Tom had alluded to before, and which if all students take the LOA, are you technically, okay, no, we answered that one. Sorry about that. So the question was, if a student withdraws, schools are not required to refund Title IV funds. This applies to withdrawals after which date. So I think Tom had alluded to, he would, you said to look at the student situation and, the payment period and look at the situation of the student. And I know Tom had referred to the electronic announcement March 5th. So would you say it's a combination of all of the above, but it could have started from January too? So we're not sure, or?
Yeah. We don't know. Right now, like he said, the two notices we have are March.
Okay.
And that's when they address COVID.
And again, I truly do believe this is on a case-by-case basis. And Sally, would you not agree? And again, it's back to documenting, and there's going to be some degree of professional judgment that has to be utilized here.
Right.
I would say if it's a student in the state of Washington, they could have been exposed very early on.
Right.
The biggest hit area in the beginning.
That's true. Okay, thank you for that. And now,
and again, one of the other ways to look at this, and Sally, help me with this one to make sure that I'm right, because this is where they've linked this to the payment period or period of enrollment. So wouldn't some of this be looking back to when the start of your payment period or period of enrollment for a group was?
Yes, but I think they're going to look at when you do the RTT4 and the student's withdrawn, when did that student withdraw and what payment period are they in at that point? And then when that payment period started, but that doesn't matter.
Right. I think I was just trying to see if an institution could make the definitive statement of within our institution, as they're attempting to document and make something verifiable and defensible for each institution. And I think that some of this is going to have to be institution by institution. It would be for, they could say something akin to, for payment periods in our institution that began on forward until the time that all of this is stopped, that would be the period. And, I'm trying, in terms of trying to give them, I know everybody's searching for an answer, and I know we don't really have one. I'm just trying to throw out options.
Because you could have two students start on the same date, one's full-time, one's part-time.
And it'd be totally different. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and their second payment period is going to be totally different because if they're clocked, they're based on how many hours they did and when they earn the hours. And if you're a school that does period of enrollment, the student could have dropped recently but started a long time ago. So you can't link it to start dates. You can't link, you have to link it to where's a student in what payment period or what period of enrollment when they withdraw.
And again, is that within the context of the qualifying emergency period?
Right. I mean, what reason did they give you for dropping? If they gave you a reason for dropping, that they don't have child care, but the child care had nothing to do with the pandemic because the daycares were still open, then no, that's not a reason to do it. But now all the daycares are closed, so it would be a very valid reason.
Amen.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Tom. Okay, our next question looks like, how far back in loan or payments can employers pay their employee loans? In other words, can an employer pay an employee loans if they have been paying? Not really sure about that question.
It looks like it was just recently, just as this stimulus bill was passed.
It is, but it's up to a maximum of $5,250 annually. So
Up to January of next year.
Up to January of next year. So even if an individual is paying, I think it's a two-part question. Yes, employers can still gain the tax relief and the employee gain the benefit even if they are currently making their own payments. Yes, that can be done, and yes, both parties then have an additional benefit. In terms of the time frame, the statute gives the employers from enactment, which was Friday of last week.
That's our answer. That's our answer.
Limited January 1st
Yeah.
to make the determination of if they want to try and use that tax benefit for their employees and to what degree.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for that, Sally. Is the loan interest during the 6-month period forgiven or just deferred?
Frozen, there is none.
Okay, awesome. For Section 3513, will the temporary deferment apply to Parent Plus loans as well? And will the deferment request be required, or will this just be automatically effective?
I didn't see any language about plus, did you?
No, that's what I was just, I don't know whether you saw the crinkle of my eye. I don't believe that it, I can go, it doesn't address plus loans. The statute doesn't contemplate that, so I don't think so.
Interesting. Where can I access details behind each of the provisions outlined in the CARES Act?
I will happily provide, and FAME already has some of this, but I will happily make sure that you have access to, and hopefully we can put it somewhere on FAME's website, a copy of several crucial documents, including the comprehensive text, the breakdowns that I've written that address just these areas that I've talked about, and also the summaries and write-ups from Capitol Hill. I can get those, and again, we'll have those for people for FAME to support and provide to you in the very near future.
We can post it on our website.
Yes, we do have COVID resources available. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
For the R2T4 requirement being waived during a student's current period of enrollment or payment period, is there an as of date? So I think you guys had answered this kind of before.
Several times.
Yes.
Well, we tried.
Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. For federal work study.
They don't like our answer, Sally.
No, I think they like your answer. They're just trying to fish to see if we're going to give them something different. No, but for federal work study, is the institution match waived for student paychecks? In other words, can we use 100% of federal funds to pay students their average hours worked, regardless of the job type?
I believe the answer to that is yes, but I would prefer you put it in writing and let me ask the Department of Ed folks that question directly.
I would think it would be yes also, because you don't have to do the matching funds.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
As federal work studies concerned, so far, there has been nothing that says you don't have to do your 7% community service. And there's nothing that says you don't have to do your student reads. So remember, if you're going to use that money to pay out to students and transfer it to SEOG, you might want to, if you haven't used those portions yet, hold off on transferring that until we know more.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Thank you, Tom.
Sally, write that one down for me,
I will.
please. I mean, that's one we need to, that's a sooner rather than later. They need to hear that one.
Okay.
Right, because they'll start spending that money left and right.
Okay, so last question before we go. Can we accept student loan disbursements that were due prior to the school closing?
Disbursements are always the same. If the student's not there, you can't accept that disbursement at the time. So that money should have gone back, and then you could have re-requested it. Or if the student was still kind of there and you just temporarily closed, even though you should have sent it back, I guess if you can get the students just and they're back enrolled. You know, the whole problem is with loans, you only have 3 days. So if you weren't open and the kids weren't there, you should have really sent the money back at that point. And now they're back in school doing distance ed. You are eligible for that money, but it might still be a ding on an audit if you didn't do the whole thing. Problem is, I just don't want to tell you yes to keep it.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that, Sally. And thank you, Tom, again, for this incredibly informative and engaging and time-sensitive webinar. We really appreciate you both getting together and providing us all of this information.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Joe.
I'm happy to do it, and I will provide a number of the things that we talked about. And as it says, stay tuned because there certainly will be much more forthcoming. You know, we are not alone. I know that you know, you guys have asked a lot of very, very good questions. You're not alone in these. These are questions that are being contemplated across the entire spectrum. FAME has done a phenomenal job in helping to access a lot of the information early on. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to help. And as it says, stay tuned because there will certainly be more to follow.
Okay.
Okay, thank you everybody for attending. We hope you enjoyed it and it was useful.
Bye.
Stay safe and be
Bye.
well. Bye, you guys.
You too.